Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug most people have never heard of, at a moment most people have forgotten, inside a summer that everyone thinks they already understand. The Summer of Love, 1967, San Francisco. You know the version. Flowers, Grateful Dead, young people discovering consciousness. The cultural mythology has been running on that version for 60 years, and it's fine as far as it goes. Here is the part that doesn't make it into the montages. On June 21st, 1967, a man walked through a crowd in Golden Gate Park and handed out 5,000 tablets of a drug that nobody in that crowd had taken before. For free. No explanation. The drug was new. Nobody in that crowd knew what was in it. The man who handed it out had done some tests and not enough tests, and not at anywhere near the dose he was distributing. The tablets were supposed to produce something like an LSD trip. They produced something longer, something harder, something that didn't respond to the only medical treatment anyone knew to give. The drug was called STP. It stood for Serenity, Tranquility, and Peace. The people who took it that evening experienced something else. By nightfall, 23 of them were at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. The clinic had been open for exactly 2 weeks. The doctors reached for the standard treatment for bad LSD trips. The treatment didn't work. The doctors didn't know why. They were managing something they had never seen before with a protocol built for something different, and the gap between those two things was about to get a newspaper headline. This is the story of the drug the Summer of Love tried to forget. The one that terrified the doctors, baffled the chemists, and got classified by the federal government before anyone had run the basic pharmacological experiments. The one that disappeared so completely that most histories of the 1960s don't mention it at all. It starts with a free tablet in a park on the longest day of the year. It ends with a question nobody ever got around to answering. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying the channel, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's go back to the longest day of 1967. Here is what the drug felt like. You take it at noon. You are in Golden Gate Park. The sun is doing what it does in June in San Francisco, which is making a sustained argument for the idea that everything is probably fine. The people around you have taken things before. They know the schedule. With acid, something starts at 20 minutes. 30 at the outside, colours first, then the geometry. 30 minutes, nothing. You know drugs that take time. You don't know this one. Nobody in this park knows this one. The man who handed it out, and he didn't introduce himself, said it was something new, said it was good, said it was a step up, said it was legal, which matters, because acid stopped being legal in California 8 months ago, and the supply since then has gotten complicated. An hour. Still nothing. Something at the edge of things, maybe. Could be the sun. Could be the general atmosphere of 60,000 people having a collective experience in your vicinity. You have a second tablet in your pocket. You take it. Because an hour has passed and nothing has happened, and that seems like the reasonable interpretation of available information. This is the wrong interpretation. 2 hours after the first tablet, the drug arrives. Not gently. LSD opens in stages. The world brightens, then deepens, then starts rearranging itself, and each stage gives you a moment to register what's happening before the next one starts. STP doesn't do that. STP arrives the way a power outage arrives. Not gradually, but all at once, the entire experience present and running before you've had time to confirm it started. The grass is too detailed. Your heartbeat is present in a way your heartbeat is not usually present. The people nearby are moving with a significance you can't name. The sky's a colour that doesn't correspond to any sky you've seen before. Not a different shade of blue, but a different relationship to blue. A blue that seems to be making an argument. Your heart rate is up. That's the amphetamine side. This drug is not purely psychedelic. It is built on an amphetamine structure. Speed, roughly, underneath the mescaline effect. And at 20 milligrams, the stimulant component is present and not subtle. You're not calm, you're alert, and your alertness has nowhere to put itself, because the world you are alert to has become difficult to read. Then the second tablet joins the first. Both hands on the controls now. The visuals double. Time stops working normally. An hour passes in what feels like 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes takes an hour, and eventually you stop trying to tell which is which. This is going to last a long time. LSD at a standard dose, 8 to 12 hours. STP at the dose in those tablets, 20 milligrams, which is 4 to 20 times higher than a strong active dose, lasts 16 to 24 hours. The Berkeley Barb had run a piece that spring with a headline that was technically accurate. STP takes you 4 times as far. 4 times as far means 4 times as long. 4 times as long when the experience has turned bad is not a description of a trip. It is a description of a sentence. You are in hour 3. There are approximately 17 hours remaining. You don't know this yet. Later, Dr. David Smith, the doctor who opened the clinic 2 weeks ago and is about to have the strangest fortnight of his medical career, will estimate that for every person who came through his door that evening, 39 more were riding it out somewhere in the neighbourhood. Not seeking treatment, not calling anyone, just finding a floor or a couch or a patch of grass and waiting for something that wasn't stopping. 39 to 1. Which means the 23 patients who showed up the first night represent roughly the visible fraction of a much larger number. Somewhere between 800 and 2,000 people, by the math, were doing what you're doing. Holding on, watching the hours pass, waiting for the ordinary world to come back. It came back, eventually. For most of them, it came back. But eventually, for a drug that runs 24 hours at 20 milligrams, is a long time. The drug had 2 names and they meant opposite things. STP officially stood for Serenity, Tranquility and Peace. That was the name the people distributing it wanted it to have. The name the underground press ran with. The San Francisco Oracle called it a legal alternative to acid. The Berkeley Barb said it was the next thing. The counterculture needed a substitute. California had banned LSD in October of '66, and STP was legal, STP was available, and STP was, according to the coverage, better, longer, more. Unofficially, STP borrowed its name from the motor oil additive, the brand that promised extra power from every engine. The tagline was something like, STP is the racer's edge, your mind but tuned. The counterculture liked that version, more of everything, further than anything. The chemical name was DOM, 2,5-dimethoxy-4-methylamphetamine, a molecule structured as a hybrid of mescaline and amphetamine, which meant it hit the same receptor as LSD and mescaline, the serotonin 2A receptor, the one that governs how the brain filters reality, while also doing what speed does to the body underneath. Heart rate up, blood pressure up, the nervous system running hot and looking for a problem. The man who synthesized it had tested it carefully on himself. He had worked up from 1 milligram to 12. He stopped at 12 because 12 was, in his professional assessment as a chemist who had taken hundreds of novel compounds, much too strong. The tablets in the park were 20 milligrams. Nobody had tested 20 milligrams. Nobody had tested 15. The creator had not distributed dosing guidelines. He had not been consulted about the distribution plan, and he had not been in Golden Gate Park on June 21st. He was not, in any meaningful sense, in control of what happened next. At 3 milligrams, which is how researchers would begin testing the compound later that year, the drug produced effects they described as potentially useful: euphoria, enhanced perception, introspective clarity. At 3 milligrams, the experience lasted about 8 hours and responded to the standard interventions. Manageable. At 20 milligrams, none of that was true. The duration was different, the intensity was different, the body's response was different, and the chlorpromazine, the standard antidote, was different at 20 milligrams in ways the doctors were going to spend weeks trying to understand. The creator knew all of this. He had written it down. 12 milligrams was too much. He was certain. The tablets were 20 milligrams. Nobody asked him. The neighbourhood that received 5,000 tablets of STP was already running past its design specifications. Haight-Ashbury, 15 square blocks of Victorian houses, head shops, free kitchens and crash pads. Population somewhere between 50 and 100,000 more than it was built for. They had come from everywhere. Suburbs, colleges, small towns, military bases, anywhere that felt like a place worth leaving. The war was on television every night. The draft was real. The country their parents had built was from a certain angle, producing outcomes they had decided to refuse. What the refusal looked like in practice: communal living, free food from the diggers, a group who ran free kitchens on the theory that removing money from daily life was a reasonable first step, music in the streets, and a general willingness to take whatever was being offered, because the operating principle was abundance and trust, and the idea that the person handing you something probably had your interests at heart. The Grateful Dead, the band that had become synonymous with the scene, lived nearby. Jefferson Airplane played regular shows. The air smelled like whatever combination of incense, marijuana, and 60,000 people in a 15-block radius produces, which is something specific and not easily forgotten. The Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic had opened 14 days before the solstice celebration. A doctor named David Smith had watched tens of thousands of young people arrive in this neighbourhood and done the obvious math. They were going to get sick. They were going to have bad trips. They were going to need someone who would treat them without arresting them or shaming them, or using the occasion as evidence for a conclusion that had been reached before they walked in the door. The San Francisco Health Department told Smith they weren't interested in a clinic for hippies. The hippies were temporary, the health department said. Smith opened the clinic anyway. He had been open 14 days when STP arrived. The first patient that evening was a 19-year-old man who had been awake for 2 days. He sat down in the clinic and told the doctor that he had taken something at the solstice and it hadn't stopped. He knew the name, STP, everyone in the park knew the name, but he didn't know what was in it, didn't know the dose, didn't know why 36 hours later it was still happening. The doctor reached for what he knew. Doctors always reach for what they know. What he knew was chlorpromazine, thorazine, the antipsychotic that had been managing bad LSD trips for years. You give a dose, you wait, the experience retreats, the patient comes back. The procedure had a track record. The procedure was what you did. It didn't work the way it was supposed to. Not catastrophically. The patient didn't deteriorate, but the experience wasn't retreating the way it retreated with LSD. The tool that was supposed to end this was not ending this, and the doctor didn't know why, because the question of why required knowing what drug he was treating, and nobody had yet identified STP as DOM, and the pharmacology of DOM at 20 milligrams was, at that point in history, essentially a blank page. Within the hour, 23 more patients came through the door. Same story, same question. When does it end? The chlorpromazine did not make things actively worse, at least not obviously, for the patients in the clinic. They were managed imperfectly with supportive care, calm rooms, calm voices, time, and most of them came through. The doctor kept notes. He was a careful, systematic doctor who had founded a clinic on the principle that these patients deserved the same quality of attention as any other, and the notes would matter later. 32 STP patients in total over the days that followed. Most of them recovered. 13 other patients that night went to San Francisco General Hospital instead. They did not do as well. The reason they didn't do as well is connected to something about STP's chemistry, and something about the environment in which they received care, and it is a thread that runs through the rest of this story. But that thread comes later. Right now, it is the evening of June 21st. There are 23 people in a 2-week-old clinic. The doctor has a tool that isn't quite working, and no explanation for why. The drug, meanwhile, is still running. The drug didn't end when it was supposed to, because it wasn't the drug anyone thought it was. Not at the level that mattered. Not the molecular level, where the difference between what people in Golden Gate Park assumed they were taking and what they were actually taking turned out to be the difference between an experience with a shape and an experience with no exit in sight. STP, DOM, chemically, was not a variant of LSD. It shared some territory with LSD, the way two countries might share a border without sharing a language or a legal system, or an idea of what time means. Both compounds arrived at the serotonin 2A receptor, which is the receptor that governs, in rough terms, how the brain decides what is real. Flood that receptor and the brain's filtering system starts making errors. Not random errors, but specific ones, consistent ones, the kind that produce visual distortions and pattern recognition running at 10 times its normal speed, and the general sense that the world has acquired a layer of meaning it doesn't usually display. This is what LSD does. This is also what DOM does. At that level of description, they are cousins. But DOM was not just a psychedelic. It was also an amphetamine. This is the part the underground press did not emphasize, possibly because it complicated the sales pitch. DOM's full chemical name, 2,5-dimethoxy-4-methylamphetamine, contains the word amphetamine because that is what its molecular backbone is. Speed. The same structural family as the drugs that truck drivers took to stay awake on long hauls, that soldiers had been given in the Second World War, that the counterculture's own speed freaks were running on in the alleys a few blocks from the solstice celebration. Amphetamines do things to the body that psychedelics don't. They elevate heart rate, they raise blood pressure, they compress the blood vessels and instruct the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight system, the one that decides whether to run from the lion or fight the lion, to switch on and stay on. In normal circumstances, this produces alertness, energy, the sensation of being very much awake and capable of things. In the context of a psychedelic experience that is already running at full volume, it produces something else. The stimulant load doesn't cancel out the hallucinatory effect, it amplifies the anxiety underneath it. The heart rate goes up, and the part of the brain that monitors heart rate notices the heart rate going up, and concludes that something threatening must be happening, because why else would the heart be doing this? And the threat response feeds back into the psychedelic experience, and the psychedelic experience feeds back into the threat response, and the loop tightens. This is why the accounts from STP patients that summer so often describe not just visual distortion, but panic, not just strangeness, but terror. The drug was producing two things simultaneously that do not, in combination, produce equanimity. The counterculture had a name for this kind of experience, not for STP specifically, STP was too new for folk taxonomies, but for the general category of psychedelic trips that went wrong in this particular way. They called it a bad trip, which is a phrase so mild and so insufficient for what it describes that it has always been a little strange that it stuck. A bad trip is not a bad experience the way a bad meal is a bad experience, or a bad film, or a bad day at work. A bad trip is a state in which your brain's reality processing system has been hijacked and is producing output that your threat detection system is interpreting as an emergency, and there is no clear exit, and the usual tools for managing distress, reason, distraction, waiting it out, are running on hardware that has temporarily stopped cooperating. And STP, at 20 milligrams, was particularly good at producing this. The slow onset was the trap. It is worth spending a moment on the slow onset because it is the mechanism through which a drug that might have been merely unpleasant became, for a significant number of people, genuinely harrowing. LSD starts in 20 to 40 minutes. Experienced users knew this. The people in Golden Gate Park on June 21st were, many of them, experienced. They had taken acid before. They knew what the first 20 minutes felt like, the slight brightening, the warmth at the edges of things, the body's way of announcing that something was beginning. When those signals arrived, you knew where you were, you could orient, you could make a choice about what you did next. DOM at 20 milligrams starts in 60 to 90 minutes, sometimes longer. At that dose, the onset can be slow enough that an experienced drug user, someone who has taken LSD dozens of times and knows what the first half hour of a psychedelic experience feels like, can sit in a park for an hour and conclude reasonably that the tablet was weak, or a dud, or simply not enough. The familiar signals are not there. The brightening hasn't come, the geometry hasn't started, nothing is happening, or close enough to nothing that the difference doesn't matter, so they take another one. This is not stupidity. This is the application of prior knowledge to a situation where prior knowledge does not apply, which is something that happens to intelligent, careful people all the time. A doctor who has treated 100 patients with a particular condition and then encounters the 101st, who has the same condition presenting differently, might make the same error. Reach for the tool that has worked 100 times before and discover that the 101st case has different rules. The people in the park who took a second tablet were doing exactly what their experience had taught them made sense. Their experience had simply never included DOM before. Nobody's had. And then, 60 to 90 minutes after the first tablet, the drug arrives. Not the second tablet, the first, at full strength, at 20 milligrams. With the stimulant load running underneath it and the duration clock starting now, and somewhere in that person's system, the second tablet is still on its way. What patients described, in the accounts that made it into the medical literature and the clinic's notes, was not just an intense psychedelic experience. It was an experience that refused to have a shape. LSD has a shape. There is a rising phase, a plateau, a descent. Even at the peak, even when the experience is at its most extreme, experienced users can usually locate themselves within that shape, can feel, at some level, that there is an arc, that the peak implies a descent, that this will not go on forever. This knowledge is not nothing. It is, in fact, the difference between an experience that is frightening but manageable and an experience that is frightening and open-ended. STP at 20 milligrams did not feel like it had a shape. It felt like it had started and would continue. Not forever, but the duration was long enough that the question of when it would end stopped being theoretical and became practical and then urgent. At hour 8, which would have been the end of a standard LSD trip, the experience was not ending. At hour 10, it was not ending. At hour 12, the sun was doing something different than it had been doing before, which meant time was passing, which meant the drug was still running, which meant the question of when this stops was no longer abstract. The first patient at the clinic that evening had been awake for 36 hours before he decided he needed help. 36 hours of this. Not an abstraction, not a clinical category, but 36 hours of the nervous system running at an intensity it was not designed to sustain for that duration, unable to sleep, unable to return to baseline, waiting for something that was not coming. The clinic's notes from those days describe patients who were frightened but mostly coherent, capable of conversation, capable of answering questions, in a state of prolonged distress rather than acute crisis. This is a meaningful distinction. STP did not, at the doses distributed that summer, appear to produce psychosis in the clinical sense. It produced something closer to exhaustion under extreme conditions, a nervous system that had been running far above its normal operating parameters for far longer than it had been designed to, wearing down not because the drug was intrinsically more dangerous than LSD, but because the drug lasted so much longer than LSD that the body simply had more time to become tired of it. Time, in other words, was the drug's most dangerous property. The drug's name had been shifting in the neighbourhood since the first bad trip started appearing. STP, Serenity, Tranquility and Peace, was what the people who distributed it called it. It was the name in the underground press. It was the name on nobody's lips who had spent 36 hours in a state they had not signed up for. In the weeks that followed the solstice celebration, as the accounts circulated and the clinic's patients went home and told people what had happened to them, alternative interpretations of the initials started appearing. The counterculture was creative about this kind of thing. STP became, in some circles, serenity, terror, and panic. In others, simply, stop the pain. The aspiration had not survived contact with the reality. The name was being renegotiated from the ground up by the people who had taken it in the only way that felt accurate. The drug had promised something. The drug had delivered something else. The gap between those two things was, in the summer of '67, the most interesting and most uncomfortable question in the Haight. There is something specific about why the redosing problem was so difficult to anticipate, and it has to do with the difference between drugs that are consistent and drugs that are not. LSD is consistent. Not perfectly consistent. Set and setting and individual brain chemistry all play a role, but consistent in the sense that its basic pharmacokinetic profile is stable and knowable. It starts in a predictable window. It peaks in a predictable window. It ends in a predictable window. This means that a community of people who have used LSD repeatedly, over years, develops an accurate shared model of what the drug does and when. The model is not written down. It is transmitted through experience and conversation, and the kind of collective knowledge that forms around any practice that a large group of people engage in seriously. DOM was new. There was no collective model. There was the Berkeley Barb headline, which told you it lasted longer but did not tell you it started slower. There was the San Francisco Oracle, which told you it was a legal alternative to acid but did not tell you it was structurally an amphetamine. There were the people who had tried it in small amounts in the weeks before the solstice, and those people had mostly not taken it at 20 milligrams, and the difference between 5 milligrams of DOM and 20 milligrams of DOM is not a difference of degree. It is a difference in kind. At 5 milligrams, the onset is faster, the experience is shorter, the stimulant component is present but not dominant. You can feel at 5 milligrams that the drug has a shape, that it is going somewhere and will eventually come back. At 20 milligrams, the shape disappears. The stimulant component takes over the anxiety channel and doesn't release it, and the onset is slow enough, at this dose for reasons to do with the body's absorption rate and the liver's metabolism of the compound, that a gap of 60 to 90 minutes between taking the drug and feeling anything is entirely possible, entirely consistent with what the pharmacology predicts, and entirely at odds with everything the available community knowledge would have suggested. The people who took a second tablet had not been negligent. They had been unlucky. They had a drug that behaved unlike anything they had encountered before, at a dose that nobody had documented at that scale, in a context where the only information available was promotional material from underground newspapers that had been written by people who had themselves not taken it at 20 milligrams. The information gap was total. The consequences were proportional. Something the researchers who studied the clinic's cases would note later was that the most distressing experiences were not, in every case, the ones involving the highest doses. They were the ones involving redosing. The patients who had taken one tablet and ridden out an uncomfortable 36 hours were, in general, more functional and less traumatized than the patients who had taken two. The mathematical difference between one 20mg tablet and two 20mg tablets is simple enough. The experiential difference between a trip that is frightening and long and a trip that is frightening and long and appears to have no ceiling was significant. A trip with no ceiling is a different kind of problem from a trip that is merely long. A long trip implies an end that is coming, however slowly. A trip with no ceiling implies an end that cannot be predicted, which is a different psychological situation entirely. The patients who had taken two tablets were not just experiencing more of the same thing. They were experiencing the absence of any reliable information about when the same thing would stop. This is why the names serenity, terror, and panic stuck. Not because STP was uniquely dangerous, not because it produced effects that no other drug had produced before, but because it produced those effects on a timeline that removed from the person experiencing them the one resource that makes an extreme experience survivable: the knowledge that it will end. LSD had taught the counterculture, and through the counterculture had begun to teach medicine what a bad trip looked like. What STP was teaching, to the people riding it out on floors in Haight-Ashbury, to the 19-year-old who had been awake for 2 days, to the doctors at the clinic who were taking notes and watching the chlorpromazine not quite work, was that a bad trip could be something they had no language for yet. A bad trip that doesn't end when it's supposed to is not a worse version of a bad trip. It is a different problem. What nobody in Haight-Ashbury knew, and what nobody at the clinic knew, and what the doctors treating the 23 patients that evening had no way of knowing, was that DOM had not appeared from nowhere. It had a history, a careful one. It had been synthesized 4 years earlier by a single chemist working in a corporate laboratory, tested at doses between 1 and 12 milligrams, documented in precise notes, and filed internally with a company whose main business was killing insects. The chemist had stopped at 12 milligrams because 12 was too much. He had written that down. The tablets in the park were 20 milligrams. Nobody had asked him about that. Nobody had asked him anything. The compound had left his notes and entered the world by a route he had helped create and could not control, and somewhere between the careful documentation and the Golden Gate Park crowd, the question of dosage had been answered by people who did not have access to the careful documentation. His name was Alexander Shulgin, and the distance between what he had made and what ended up in those tablets is one of the more consequential gaps in the history of the 1960s. Alexander Shulgin was not the kind of scientist who looked like what most people picture when they picture a scientist. He was tall, broad-shouldered, physically robust in the way of someone who had spent time outdoors and intended to keep doing so. He had a warmth that disarmed people who expected austerity. He cooked well. He kept detailed notes on everything, not just chemistry but conversation, dinner, the quality of light on a particular afternoon. He was, by all accounts, genuinely interested in whoever he was talking to, which in a field that produces a significant percentage of its practitioners from the same basic mould of social awkwardness and specialised obsession, was unusual enough to be remarkable. He was also, by the time he synthesised DOM in 1963, one of the more quietly extraordinary chemists in the United States. Not famous, not publicly known in any way. Working in a laboratory that made pesticides, in a building that smelled of industrial solvents, for a company whose primary business was agricultural chemicals, and whose interest in the human mind extended precisely as far as the human mind could be made to purchase more agricultural chemicals. His name inside the company was Sasha. This is what everyone called him. The formal name, Alexander Theodore Shulgin, appeared on patents and publications. The person was Sasha, and Sasha was, from the moment he was handed professional freedom as a reward for solving a beetle problem, doing something that Dow Chemical had not anticipated and would have had significant reservations about if they had been paying closer attention. He was born in Berkeley, California in 1925. His father was Russian-born. His mother was from Illinois. He was, from an early age, the kind of student who made teachers quietly reassess their assumptions about what students were capable of. At 15, he won a scholarship to Harvard. Not a scholarship to a program for gifted teenagers. A full scholarship to Harvard University, which he attended at 15 years old in the early 1940s, surrounded by people 4 and 5 years older than him, in a city he had never lived in. studying a curriculum designed for adults. He lasted 2 years before the Second World War interrupted. He joined the Navy at 19, served, came back to California, and went to the University of California at Berkeley for his undergraduate degree in chemistry and then his doctorate in biochemistry. After the doctorate came postdoctoral work in psychiatry and pharmacology at the University of California, San Francisco. This is where the direction became clear, although Shulgin himself might not have been able to name it yet. He was interested in the brain. Not in the abstract way that chemists are sometimes interested in the systems their molecules act on, but in the specific, experiential, first-person way of someone who had started to suspect that the most interesting questions in science were the ones about what it felt like to be conscious and what happened when you changed the conditions of that consciousness. He took a job at Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical in the 1950s and early 60s was a large, successful, and in certain respects genuinely innovative company. It made things: saran wrap, napalm, agricultural chemicals of various kinds. It was not, to put it gently, an organisation whose institutional culture was oriented toward the exploration of human consciousness. It was oriented toward the production of compounds that killed pests, wrapped food, and periodically generated legal and ethical controversies that it managed with the confidence of a company that had survived similar controversies before and expected to survive similar ones in the future. Shulgin arrived there in the late 1950s as a senior research chemist. He had a laboratory. He had colleagues. He had for a while a standard research program that produced standard results. Then he invented Zectran. Zectran was the first biodegradable insecticide. Before Zectran, insecticides had a tendency to persist in the environment, to remain in the soil, in the water, in the bodies of the animals and birds and fish that encountered them, accumulating up the food chain in concentrations that were increasingly recognized as a problem. Zectran broke down. It did what it was supposed to do, and then it stopped doing anything at all, which was not how insecticides had previously worked and which turned out commercially to be extremely valuable. Dow was pleased. Dow was, more specifically, pleased enough to give Shulgin what he had not asked for but had perhaps hoped for: freedom. Professional freedom, which is the rarest and most valuable thing that a large institution can give a scientist, and which most large institutions give only when the scientist has demonstrated enough commercial usefulness that the freedom seems like a reasonable investment. Shulgin had demonstrated enough commercial usefulness. Dow gave him the freedom. He chose psychedelics. This choice had a specific origin. Not a theoretical one, not an intellectual interest in altered states that could be traced to a paper he had read or a lecture he had attended. A specific event in 1960, 3 years before, he synthesized DOM. Someone gave him mescaline. Mescaline is the psychoactive compound in peyote, a cactus that had been used in indigenous ceremonies in the Americas for thousands of years and had been isolated, identified, and synthesized by Western chemists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1960, it had a reasonably well-established scientific literature and a reasonably well-established reputation for producing experiences that were vivid, intense, and difficult to categorize within the existing vocabulary of pharmacology. Shulgin took it. What happened over the following hours was, by his own account, something he had not expected and could not have prepared for. He relived episodes of his childhood that he had not consciously remembered. He experienced what he later described as a childlike and fearless love of exploration, a quality he felt had been present in him before the systematic demands of education and professional life had organized it into something more manageable and less surprising. He experienced the sensation of understanding something about his own mind that had previously been available to him only as a theory. He came back from the experience changed, not dramatically changed in any outward way. He remained a chemist, remained employed, remained recognizably himself, but changed in the sense that he now had a question he intended to spend his life answering, and the question was this: what happens, precisely and in detail, when you modify the molecular structure of a compound like mescaline, and what does that tell you about the relationship between chemistry and consciousness? This is the question that Zectran and Dow's gratitude, and the professional freedom that followed from both, allowed him to begin answering. Shulgin's approach to psychedelic chemistry was methodical in a way that set him apart from almost everyone else working in adjacent territory, of whom there were, in the early 1960s, not very many. He worked alone, or nearly alone. He synthesized compounds in his laboratory at Dow, worked up the chemistry until he had something pure and characterized, determined a starting dose based on the compound's structural relationship to other things he already knew, and then took it himself. He kept detailed notes on everything: the dose, the time of onset, the character of the experience, the quality of the return to baseline, the duration of each phase. He developed a rating scale, numbered from +1 to +4, for describing the intensity of psychedelic experiences. +1 was subtle. +4 was the kind of experience that a person might have once in a lifetime and spend the rest of their life trying to understand. He used the scale consistently, which meant his notes were comparable across experiments in a way that nobody else's notes were, because nobody else was doing anything quite like this. He was doing it inside a pesticide company, with their equipment, on their time. This fact deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the more remarkable institutional arrangements in the history of psychedelic research. Dow Chemical Company, manufacturers of saran wrap and napalm and agricultural chemicals, was providing laboratory facilities, professional status, and organizational cover for one of the most systematic private investigations into the chemistry of human consciousness that has ever been conducted. They did not know the full extent of what they were sponsoring. They were happy with Zectrin and happy with the other commercial compounds Shulgin occasionally produced when they asked. Him too, and otherwise largely left him alone. Shulgin's notebooks, which he kept meticulously throughout this period, were later described by colleagues as an extraordinary document, a record of systematic self-experimentation that had no precedent and, because of the legal conditions that later developed around psychedelic chemistry, would have no sequel. DOM came out of this period. The synthesis happened in 1963, or possibly 1964. The sources are slightly inconsistent on the precise year, and Shulgin's own first bioassay is documented as January 4th, 1964, which may be the first time he tested it on himself rather than the first time he made it. The distinction matters less than the sequence. He had been working on a series of substituted amphetamines, molecules built on the amphetamine backbone but with various chemical groups attached at specific positions. He was interested in a particular position, what he called the 4 position on the phenyl ring, which he had come to believe was especially significant for psychedelic activity. Small changes at the 4 position, he had observed, produced large changes in effect. This was interesting scientifically. It was also, from a certain angle, the kind of observation that could keep a chemist busy for a long time. DOM was what happened when he attached a methyl group at the 4 position of a compound that already had 2 methoxy groups at the 2 and 5 positions. The full chemical name, 2,5-dimethoxy-4-methylamphetamine, describes this architecture. The 2 and 5 positions carry methoxy groups. The 4 position carries a methyl. The backbone is amphetamine. He named it DOM for desoxymethyl, referring to its structural relationship to an earlier compound. Then he took it, starting, as always, at a dose low enough that he was confident nothing dramatic would happen, 1 milligram, which produced by his notes a mild effect, then 2 milligrams, then 3, then higher, working up gradually over the course of many experiments, following the systematic protocol he had developed over years of working up to active doses of novel compounds, not because he was reckless with his own neurochemistry, but because he was careful with it, and careful in this context meant moving slowly, documenting everything, stopping when the notes indicated that he had found the edge of what was interesting and was approaching the edge of what was manageable. He stopped at 12 milligrams, because 12 milligrams, in his professional assessment as a chemist who had tested himself with hundreds of novel compounds, was much too strong. The experience at 12 milligrams was, by his account, at the outer boundary of what a person could navigate while remaining sufficiently coherent to take notes and maintain any meaningful relationship to the ordinary world. He wrote this down. He was specific about it. The notes did not say 12 milligrams is not recommended. The notes said, in effect, do not do this. He also wrote that DOM was, at the doses he considered appropriate, 3 to 5 milligrams, in the range where the experience was intense but navigable, the most promising compound he had synthesized. He believed it had therapeutic potential. He believed, with the cautious optimism of a scientist who had spent years developing a methodology for evaluating these things, that it might be genuinely useful in psychotherapy, that the clarity and introspective quality of the experience at lower doses was the kind of thing that a trained therapist could work with. He filed an internal disclosure with Dow's patent department in 1965, describing DOM's potential psychiatric applications. The patent department filed it. The company noted it. Nobody at Dow did anything with it, because Dow was a pesticide company and DOM was not a pesticide. Shulgin left Dow Chemical in late 1966. The departure was not acrimonious. He was not fired. He left because he had decided that the independent life of a consultant, expert witness, and university lecturer, working for himself, advising on cases involving chemistry, teaching occasionally, gave him more freedom than even the unusual latitude Dow had provided. He set up a laboratory in a small building behind his house in Lafayette, California, a suburb of the East Bay, and continued the work he'd been doing at Dow, but with complete autonomy over what he studied and when. He was 41 years old. He had a backyard laboratory, a set of notebooks documenting years of systematic self-experimentation, and a compound he believed was important sitting in those notebooks, no longer protected by his Dow affiliation, no longer being actively developed by anyone. DOM was Dow's intellectual property. They owned the synthesis. If Shulgin wanted to develop it further, to push it toward the clinical trials that might establish its therapeutic value, he would have needed Dow's cooperation, and Dow's cooperation was not forthcoming, because Dow was not in the business of psychiatric pharmaceuticals, and the institutional will to develop a psychedelic compound in the climate of 1966 was not something Dow possessed. The clinical path was closed. What was open was everything else. The compound was still legal. California had banned LSD in October of '66, but DOM was not LSD, and the law had not caught up with DOM, and in 1966 and into '67, the compound sat in a legal grey area where it could be synthesized and possessed and in principle distributed without the specific legal prohibitions that had just attached to its more famous cousin. Shulgin was not, by temperament or inclination, a person who distributed drugs. He was a scientist. He was also a scientist who had a compound he believed was valuable, who believed it was in danger of what he called pharmacological oblivion, disappearing into the notebooks and the filing cabinets and the institutional memory of a company that had no plans for it, and who was looking, in the winter of '66 and the spring of '67, for a way to ensure that didn't happen. The way he found was not the way he would have chosen if he'd been given more options, but the way he found was the one that was available. There was one person in San Francisco in the winter of 1967 who had the chemistry, the infrastructure, and the distribution network to take a compound from someone's notes and put it in front of thousands of people within months. He had been manufacturing LSD since 1965. By conservative estimates, he had already produced more than 1 million doses, and the people who had taken them, musicians, writers, artists, the entire intellectual and creative apparatus of the counterculture, trusted the product because the product had never let them down. He was a self-taught chemist, a sound engineer, and the de facto pharmacist of a generation. His name was Augustus Owsley Stanley III, grandson of a Kentucky governor. Everyone called him Bear. Bear was not a name anyone had given him. It was a name he had arrived at, or that had arrived at him, in the way that names sometimes do for people with enough force of personality that the official version stops being the operative one. Augustus Owsley Stanley III was the official version. Bear was what he was. He was short, stocky, physically present in the way of someone who occupied space deliberately. He had strong opinions about food. He had been, for years, a committed carnivore who believed that grain was actively harmful, and that the body functioned best on meat and dairy and very little else, a position he held with the conviction of someone who had arrived at it, through personal experimentation, and was not especially interested in counter-arguments. He had strong opinions about sound. He had been building and modifying audio equipment since he was a teenager, and by the mid-1960s was doing work with concert sound systems that had no real precedent. He had strong opinions about LSD quality, which was the area in which his opinions had the most immediate practical significance, because Bear was in the business of making LSD, and he was making it in quantities that no private individual had made it before. He had started in 1965. The drug was still legal. He was living in Berkeley, studying briefly at the university, and had acquired a chemistry degree's worth of practical knowledge through the combination of reading, experimentation, and the particular kind of focused autodidactism that characterizes people who are less interested in credentials than in knowing how to do things. He set up a laboratory. He produced LSD. He produced it with a rigor and consistency that made the product, which circulated under his name, Owsley Acid, Bear Acid, something that users trusted in a way they did not trust street product of uncertain origin and uncertain purity. The money from LSD went in two directions. Some of it went to fund the Grateful Dead. This is not a detail on the margins of music history. The Grateful Dead in the early years were a band that needed money, and Owsley provided it. And the arrangement that resulted, in which the de facto pharmacist of a generation became the financial backer, sound engineer, and unofficial chemist in residence of the band that was becoming the sound of the counterculture, is one of the stranger institutional arrangements in the history of American music. He bought them equipment. He built them sound systems of a quality that no other band of that era had access to, because no other band had someone with Owsley's specific combination of obsession and cash on their payroll. He recorded their performances, thousands of hours of them, on equipment he had designed and built himself, establishing a documentation practice that would eventually produce one of the most extensive archives of live music in existence, and he turned them on. Along with, over the years, a significant portion of the people who constituted the cultural and intellectual life of the 1960s. John Lennon had reportedly attempted to secure a lifetime supply of Owsley Acid. Jimi Hendrix took it. Janis Joplin, who lived a few doors down from the Hells Angels chapter near the Grateful Dead, took it. Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor who had become the public face of LSD advocacy, who had stood in Golden Gate Park at the Human Be-In in January and told 30,000 people to turn on, tune in, and drop out, took Owsley Acid. The product was trusted because the product had never failed anyone in the way that impure or misdosed street product failed people. By 1967, the press had given him the name the Acid King. He didn't object to it. It was accurate enough. What Bear was not, and this is the gap that matters for everything that follows, was a pharmacologist. He was a chemist, a superb one, with a practical understanding of synthesis that exceeded most people who had formal training in the subject. But the question of what a compound did inside a human body at a specific dose, across a population of people with varying histories and weights and neurochemistries, was not the same question as the question of how to make it pure. Owsley understood the second question completely. The first one he understood imperfectly, and the imperfection was not something he was aware of. The story of how DOM got from Shulgin's notes to Owsley's laboratory has some gaps in it, and the gaps are not accidental. What is known is that the compound reached Owsley through a channel that Shulgin had constructed with some care. The cover story, which circulated for decades and which Shulgin himself appears to have encouraged, was that Owsley had learned about DOM from a lecture Shulgin gave at Johns Hopkins University, that the synthesis had been disclosed publicly there, and that Owsley had simply been paying attention. This was, in the careful phrasing of researchers who examined the question much later, not quite how it happened. What appears to have happened is that Shulgin gave Owsley the synthesis directly, and then suggested that the Johns Hopkins lecture be used as the cover story for how Owsley had obtained it. Shulgin had given the Johns Hopkins talk, which was real, but the talk had been used in this reconstruction as the publicly available pretext that explained how an underground chemist could have learned about a compound that was otherwise sitting in unpublished corporate documents. This was not a trivial arrangement. DOM was still Dow Chemical's intellectual property. Shulgin had synthesized it on their time and in their laboratory, and passing the synthesis to an underground chemist was, at minimum, a significant breach of professional responsibility, and potentially something more consequential than that. The cover story gave Owsley a plausible public explanation that did not implicate Shulgin. It gave Shulgin deniability, and it gave DOM the route into the world that Shulgin believed it needed. The risk Shulgin took was not small. He was a respected chemist with a legitimate career, a DEA Schedule I research license that he had obtained lawfully and depended on, and a professional reputation that institutions trusted. Discovery of his involvement with the underground production of a psychoactive compound would have been, professionally, a serious problem. He had spent years building the kind of credibility that allowed him to do the research he wanted to do within the bounds of the law. Everything he had built was at risk. he took the risk anyway. The compound was his most important work. The fear of it disappearing unexamined was, apparently, larger than the fear of consequences. Whether he fully understood what Owsley would do with it, at what dose, in what quantities, to how many people, without consulting the notes that said 12 milligrams was too strong, is a question the historical record does not fully answer. What is clear is that he passed the synthesis. What happened after that was not entirely within his control. Owsley received the synthesis and the samples. There is some evidence that the tablets distributed at the solstice celebration were made from Shulgin's own research samples, rather than from a batch Owsley had independently produced, because the independent production was still being prepared when the event arrived. Either way, the material was present and the tablets were pressed. To understand the manufacturing side, you need Tim Scully. Scully was Owsley's closest collaborator. He had the kind of mind that connected easily across domains. He had studied physics at Berkeley, without completing a degree, and had the theoretical understanding to work alongside Owsley on both the chemistry and the electronics. He had been with Owsley since the early days of the LSD operation, had built sound equipment with him, had run labs with him in Berkeley and then in Denver, where they had relocated after California banned LSD in October of '66. The Denver lab, set up in the basement of a house across the street from the zoo, was where a significant portion of Owsley's 1967 LSD production happened, including the batch called Monterey Purple, pressed into 100,000 tablets for the Monterey Pop Festival that summer. Scully is the person through whom DOM reached the third person in this chain. Nick Sand had arrived in California from Brooklyn by way of a catastrophic encounter with federal agents in Colorado. He was, by 1967, an experienced underground chemist who had come to believe, with a sincerity that people who knew him found genuinely convincing, that psychedelics were a religious sacrament and that distributing them was a form of ministry. This was not a position he held lightly or strategically. He was the kind of person who meant it, who had constructed an entire philosophical framework around it, and who would spend decades in legal trouble, partly because his commitment to the framework was stronger than his commitment to avoiding consequences. On April 1st, 1967, the calendar date lending the event a quality it did not require any assistance from irony to achieve, federal agents stopped a truck he was travelling in near Dinosaur, Colorado, at a port of entry. The agents searched the vehicle. They found 313,000 doses of LSD and what was described as a laboratory on wheels, a mobile synthesis operation capable of producing more of the same. Sand and his companion were arrested. He was freed on bail. He made his way to California, specifically to the circle of people around Owsley and Scully, who were operating the most sophisticated and prolific underground chemistry network in the country. Owsley asked Scully to teach Sand the DOM synthesis, both because Sand needed a way to recover financially from the arrest, and because DOM, being legal, offered a product that could be produced and distributed without the specific legal risks that now attach to LSD production. Scully taught him. Sand set up a company called D&H Custom Research, a name that communicated to anyone who looked closely precisely nothing about what the company actually did, in San Francisco, and obtained a surplus 200-gallon stainless steel soup kettle as a reaction vessel. A 200-gallon soup kettle, designed for institutional kitchens, for feeding hundreds of people at a time, for the kind of large-scale catering operations that happen at hospitals or military bases or school cafeterias. Sand used it as a chemical reactor for producing DOM. This detail tends to stay with people who encounter it, possibly because it captures something specific about the improvised and domestic quality of the underground chemistry world of 1967, the way in which compounds that would later be scheduled alongside heroin were being produced in equipment purchased from restaurant suppliers by people who had learned their chemistry from reading and from each other, in buildings that had no relationship to the institutional apparatus of pharmaceutical development. Sand also produced DMT and MDA out of the same operation. The soup kettle was busy. The DOM that came out of it went into tablets. The tablets were 20 milligrams each. Nobody involved in the production had conducted controlled human trials at 20 milligrams. Owsley and Scully had done some preliminary testing, but the testing had been casual, had not apparently detected the slow onset that was DOM's defining pharmacological characteristic at high doses. Shulgin's notes said 12 milligrams was too strong. Those notes were in Lafayette, California, in a backyard laboratory, in the possession of their author, and they were not consulted. Owsley's relationship to DOM was not purely commercial. He believed in it. This is important to establish, because the alternative interpretation, that this was simply a product substitution, LSD unavailable, so DOM instead, misses something significant about the way Owsley understood what he was doing. He had a theory about DOM that he found genuinely compelling. The compound structure combined psychedelic and stimulant properties in a way that, he believed, made it potentially useful as a bridge drug, a substance that might appeal to speed freaks, to the amphetamine users who were already a significant presence in Haight-Ashbury's ecosystem, and who might be drawn toward the stimulant familiarity of DOM while being introduced, through it, to the psychedelic experience that Owsley thought was genuinely transformative. The speed freaks to psychedelics theory was in retrospect optimistic, in a way that required not knowing very much about what DOM actually did at 20 milligrams. The amphetamine component at that dose did not produce the clean, familiar stimulant warmth that speed users knew. It produced something else. The nervous system running hot with nowhere to put the energy, the fear response feeding back into the psychedelic experience, and the psychedelic experience feeding back into the fear, a loop with no obvious exit. This was not a comfortable introduction to anything. It was not the bridge Owsley had envisioned. He did not know this yet. It is a characteristic feature of the 1967 psychedelic underground that the gap between theoretical understanding and practical outcome was, in several important cases, very large. The solstice celebration was on June 21st, 1967. Golden Gate Park. Thousands of people in the grass and on the paths and around the bandshell, in the particular suspension of ordinary time that outdoor music events in that era produced. The sense of a day that has stepped outside its own schedule and agreed to last as long as it needs to. The summer solstice is the longest day of the year at any latitude, and in San Francisco in 1967 it was also something that no subsequent summer solstice has quite managed to replicate. A day that felt, to the people in it, like a high watermark of something, though nobody could have told you precisely what. The Grateful Dead were part of the scene in ways that made their presence at events like this unremarkable. They played, they appeared, they were part of the furniture of the counterculture in a way that the furniture itself didn't notice anymore. Owsley was there in his capacity as the person who had made the product that was about to be distributed, and in his capacity as someone who believed that the product was good and that the people in the park were going to have a good time. He walked through the crowd with the tablets. He gave them away. This is not a metaphor or a rhetorical simplification. He literally distributed them for free, as he had distributed LSD for free on previous occasions, on the theory that the experience had value independent of commercial utility, and that restricting access by price was a kind of philosophical error. 5,000 tablets, 20 milligrams each, pressed and counted and carried to a park in June and handed to strangers on the longest day of the year. Owsley believed in what he was doing. This is not nothing. The people who distribute substances without caring about the people who take them are a different category from the people who distribute substances because they genuinely believe those substances are beneficial and want to share them as widely as possible. Owsley was firmly in the second category. He had spent 2 years producing LSD of a quality that other people's lives had depended on, and he had produced it reliably, and the trust that had built up around his name in the underground was the product of that reliability. He was handing out DOM on the same basis. This is good, this is tested, this is the thing the counterculture needs right now. The testing had been insufficient. He did not know that yet. The people who took them knew the name. STP. The underground press had been running pieces on it since April. Serenity, tranquility, and peace. The legal alternative to acid, 4 times as far. The people in the park took the tablets the way you take things that have been recommended to you by sources you trust, in a context designed to produce good experiences on the longest and most light-filled day of the year. There is some evidence that the tablets distributed at the solstice were actually from Shulgin's own research stock. The batch that Scully and Sand were producing was not yet ready at the time of the event, and the timeline suggests that what Owsley handed out that afternoon may have been the same material he had received directly from the chemist who made it, in the same doses Shulgin had provided as research samples. If this is true, then the tablets in the park were literally Dow Chemical's intellectual property, synthesized in a corporate laboratory in Michigan and distributed at a counterculture music festival in California by a man who had obtained them from their creator under a cover story they had agreed on in advance. The people in the park didn't know any of this. They knew the name. They knew it was legal. They knew it was free. They took it and they waited. And on the other side of the city, 2 weeks into its existence, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was about to find out what its first real test looked like. David Smith was 26 years old when he opened the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which is young for a doctor and very young for someone who was about to invent a new category of medicine. He was a physician at the University of California, San Francisco, not a senior figure, not someone with an established department or a research program of his own, but a young doctor who had been paying attention to what was happening in the neighborhood around him and had drawn what seemed to him like an obvious conclusion. Tens of thousands of young people were arriving in Haight-Ashbury with no money, no health insurance, and habits that were generating medical consequences. They were getting sick. They were having bad trips. They were contracting infections. They were, in the phrase that the era had settled on for what was happening to their bodies and minds, not doing well. And the existing medical infrastructure, the hospitals, the emergency rooms, the city's official health apparatus, was treating them with something between indifference and active hostility. This was not a figure of speech. Hospitals in San Francisco in 1967 were, in documented cases, turning away young people who presented in states of psychedelic distress on the grounds that they had done something to themselves deliberately and had therefore forfeited the sympathy of the institution. Some were shamed, some were admitted and then arrested for the drug use that had brought them in. Some were restrained. The prevailing medical attitude toward a 19-year-old who had taken too much of something was less patient and more consequence. Smith opened the clinic on June 7th, 14 days before the solstice celebration. He had found a space on Clayton Street, painted the walls in the colours the neighbourhood preferred, deep, saturated, the kind that were interesting even when you were not in an altered state, and put up a sign. The motto, "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege." He meant it for the specific population that the rest of the medical system had decided didn't deserve it. He had been open 2 weeks. The clinic had what Smith later called a guerrilla pharmacy. Pharmaceutical representatives, the people whose job it was to promote new drugs to doctors by leaving samples, had occasionally let him stock supplies through unofficial channels. The neighbourhood itself produced donations. The Grateful Dead played benefit concerts. Janis Joplin, who lived a few blocks away and was already on a trajectory that would not end well, performed to raise money for the clinic. The funding was precarious. The staffing was irregular. The building was not designed for medical use, but it was there, and it was open, and it had a room that the staff called the Bad Trip Room, which had tie-dye on the walls and a lava lamp and a talk-down guide, a person trained specifically to sit with someone who was in psychedelic distress and help them through it, by being calm and present and not doing any of the things that made psychedelic distress worse, like being alarmed, or judgmental, or in a hurry. The Bad Trip Room and the Talk-Down Guide were based on everything that had been learned about LSD crises over the previous several years. The learning had been empirical and hard-won, that the environment mattered enormously, that the person's subjective sense of safety was the most powerful variable in whether an experience turned and stayed bad, that a calm presence was worth more than most pharmacological interventions. This was the accumulated practical wisdom of the counterculture and the handful of clinicians who had taken its drug crises seriously, and Smith had built it into the clinic's operating model. What the accumulated wisdom had not included was STP. The first patient arrived on the evening of June 21st. His condition has been described. He had been awake for 2 days. He was frightened and exhausted in a way that exhausted and frightened don't quite capture separately, but together begin to approach. He sat in the clinic and told the doctor what had happened, which was, he had taken something at the solstice. It had not stopped, and he needed it to stop. The doctor gave him chlorpromazine. Chlorpromazine is a phenothiazine antipsychotic. Thorazine is the brand name most people know it by. It was developed in the early 1950s as an antipsychotic, became the first effective pharmaceutical treatment for schizophrenia, and had been used for LSD crises for years on the basis that it interrupted the serotonin-related mechanisms that produced the psychedelic experience. Give chlorpromazine, the experience retreats, the patient returns. The logic was sound, the evidence behind it was solid, there was a protocol, and the protocol worked. Except it was not quite working here. The patient was not retreating the way LSD patients retreated under chlorpromazine. The experience was not narrowing. He was not becoming calmer in the progressive way that chlorpromazine-administered LSD patients became calmer. Something was different, and the doctor could feel the difference without yet being able to name it. The tool was in his hand. The tool was not doing what the tool was supposed to do. Within the hour, 23 more patients arrived. Same presentation, same confusion, same question, repeated 23 times in different words. When does this end? Smith and his staff treated all 23. They gave chlorpromazine. They waited. The chlorpromazine was doing something. It wasn't making things actively worse, at least not in any immediately obvious way. But it wasn't ending the experience the way it ended LSD trips, and the patients were not going home in the expected time frame, and the bad trip room was full. Smith kept notes throughout. This is one of the things that distinguished him from the institutions that had written these patients off. He treated them as worth documenting. The notes would matter. A few things became apparent over the course of those first days and nights. The first was that chlorpromazine's failure with STP was not simply a matter of the drug requiring a higher dose or a longer wait. The mechanism was wrong. STP was not pharmacologically identical to LSD, and the assumption that a drug which worked for one would work for the other was an assumption built on structural similarity rather than on tested evidence. The two compounds both involved the serotonin 2A receptor, but DOM's amphetamine component complicated the picture. Chlorpromazine, among its various effects, had anticholinergic properties. It affected the acetylcholine system, and there were reasons, which the clinicians were beginning to work out but hadn't yet fully articulated, to believe that this interaction with DOM's stimulant profile was producing a result that was different from the simple interruption it produced with LSD. Frederick Myers, a pharmacologist from the University of California Medical Center who collaborated with Smith on the crisis, came to the conclusion, not entirely correct, but not entirely wrong either, that STP's mechanism was fundamentally different from LSD's. He was partially right. The slow onset, which he interpreted as evidence of a different mechanism, was in fact a pharmacokinetic property rather than a mechanistic one. DOM was the same family as mescaline at the receptor level, but it got there differently and stayed longer. Myers misread the cause but correctly identified the effect. Chlorpromazine was not the right tool for this situation, and using it might be doing harm. The second thing that became apparent was something simpler and more immediately actionable. The patients who received calm, supportive, non-pharmacological care were doing better than the patients who received chlorpromazine and not much else. The talk-down approach that Smith had built into the clinic's model, the bad trip room, the lava lamp, the person trained to sit with someone and be calm, was working better than the antipsychotic. Not because the antipsychotic was making things worse, necessarily, but because the calm environment was doing what STP actually required, which was not a pharmacological intervention, but a managed wait. Time was the treatment. The drug would end. The job of medicine was to make the duration survivable. This is where the story of the 7 patients becomes important. 7 people who had taken STP at the solstice celebration did not end up at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. They ended up in handcuffs. They had been in the park or in the neighbourhood, visibly distressed, behaving in ways that attracted the attention of law enforcement. Not violently, not dangerously to others, but in the way that a person behaves when their perceptual system has been running at 20 times its normal intensity for 16 hours and they are no longer able to manage the presentation of ordinary function. They were arrested. They were put in jail cells. What happened to them in those cells is documented in Smith's case notes and in the medical literature that followed. They got significantly worse, not marginally worse, not worse in a way that could be explained by the normal variation in STP experiences at 20 milligrams. Significantly, documentably, prolongedly worse. The 7 people who went to jail rather than to the clinic experienced STP crises that were, by the available evidence, more severe and more extended than the crises experienced by the people who received supportive care. Smith documented this. He was careful about it. The comparison was not a controlled trial. You cannot ethically randomize people to jail versus compassionate care. But the difference in outcomes was substantial enough that it pointed in a clear direction. The environment was the drug, Not entirely, not exclusively. DOM at 20 milligrams was going to produce an intense and prolonged experience regardless of where you were when it started. But the difference between a jail cell and a room with tie-dye on the walls and a calm person sitting with you turned out to be, for people in the specific state that STP produced, the difference between an experience that was frightening and long and an experience that was frightening and long and had been made substantially worse by its surroundings. A jail cell is, by design, an environment of minimum comfort and maximum control. For someone in a state of psychedelic distress, whose threat response is already running hot, whose perception of danger is already amplified, whose nervous system is already interpreting the world as an emergency, a jail cell is the most effective possible confirmation that the emergency is real. The walls say danger, the bars say danger, the sounds say danger. The guards who don't know what's happening and don't particularly want to find out say danger. Everything in the environment is actively collaborating with the drug's worst tendencies. The clinic was the opposite. The colours, the low light, the lava lamp, the talk-down guide who had been trained specifically for this purpose. All of it said, "This is temporary, you are safe, it will end." And the patients in the clinic over time believed it, because it was true, and because the environment made it easier to believe. The 7 in the jail cells had nothing making it easier to believe. They had everything making it harder. This finding, that environment was the primary treatment variable for STP crises, and that hostile environments actively worsened what was already a difficult experience, became one of the more significant pieces of evidence in the developing understanding of what psychedelic crises required from medicine. It was not a new idea in principle. Timothy Leary had been talking about set and setting, the mindset of the user and the environment of the experience, since his early research at Harvard. The idea that the context of a psychedelic experience shaped the experience itself was established in the literature. But the STP cases provided something that the theoretical literature had not: documented clinical evidence, from a crisis of meaningful scale, that the hostile institutional response to psychedelic distress was not just unkind, but counterproductive. It was making people sicker. It was extending the duration of experiences that were already dangerously long. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the wrong treatment. Smith was careful about how he framed this, because he was a doctor writing for other doctors, and he understood that the audience needed evidence, not advocacy. But the evidence was there. The comparison between the clinic patients and the jailed patients was as close as the circumstances allowed to a controlled comparison, and it pointed unambiguously in one direction. What STP required was not chlorpromazine. It was not a jail cell. It was time and calm and someone willing to sit with a person in an extreme state without trying to end it by force and without treating the person as a criminal for having arrived in that state. There was one other element of the clinic's treatment approach during those days that deserves attention. When chlorpromazine wasn't working and the medical staff needed an approach that didn't rely on pharmacology, they turned to someone who was available and who, it turned out, was effective. The accounts describe a person referred to in contemporary records as Swami, or Super Guru, a bearded figure, familiar in the neighbourhood, who operated in the general role of spiritual guide in the way that such roles existed in Haight-Ashbury in 1967, which is to say, informally, without credentials, and with the kind of practical authority that comes from being trusted rather than from being licensed. The physicians, when the medical tools weren't producing the results they needed, handed part of the care to this person. What Swami did was simple. He took the STP patients who were most distressed and sat them in a circle, in what the accounts describe as a calm centre. He instructed them to look at each other. He talked to them, quietly and without urgency, in the manner of someone who was not alarmed by what they were experiencing and did not expect them to be alarmed either. He was, in the terminology that was beginning to develop for exactly this kind of practice, talking them down. It worked. Not perfectly, not instantly. DOM at 20 milligrams was going to run its course regardless of what Swami said to anybody. But the patients in the circle were calmer than the patients who had received chlorpromazine, and not much else. They were more able to remain in the room, more able to maintain contact with the people around them, more able to hold the belief, which was, as it happened, true, that the experience was going to end. A bearded man sitting in a circle with people who were not capable of ordinary function, telling them it was going to be okay, turned out to be better medicine than the antipsychotic that everyone had assumed was the answer. Smith documented this too. He was the kind of doctor who documented everything. The documentation would take years to filter into the medical literature, and the medical literature would take more years to incorporate what it said into the standard approach to psychedelic crises. But the evidence was in the notes, and the notes were kept. By the end of the days that followed the solstice celebration, 32 STP patients had passed through the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Most of them recovered. Most of them eventually were okay. The experience had been frightening and long, and for many of them, genuinely traumatic in a way that would not entirely resolve. But they were alive, they were functional, and they had been cared for by people who had not judged them for being there. The 7 in the jail cells had also eventually recovered. They had taken longer, they had come through worse. The comparison between what had happened to them and what had happened to the clinic patients was going to become part of the argument for a different approach to drug crisis medicine. An argument that would take decades to win, and that is still, in various forms, being made. The drug was still running in the neighbourhood. The 5,000 tablets from the solstice had found their way into more hands than had taken them at the event itself. Sand's larger batch from the soup kettle was reaching the street. STP was not yet illegal. The underground press was still running pieces on it, though the tone had shifted from the enthusiastic coverage of the spring towards something more cautious. And Smith and Myers, watching their notes accumulate and their chlorpromazine supply fail to do what chlorpromazine was supposed to do, were coming to a conclusion. They needed to tell someone. The press conference happened in June, within days of the solstice crisis, while the clinic was still treating patients and the neighbourhood was still working through the tail end of 5,000 tablets and whatever Sand's batch had added to the supply. Smith and Myers stood in front of reporters and said what they had concluded from the notes. The conclusion had 2 parts. The first was that STP was producing psychedelic crises more severe and more prolonged than LSD crises, and that the standard treatment protocol for LSD crises, calm environment, supportive care, wait, was largely the right approach, and that the clinic had been doing it and that it was working. The second was the part that generated the headline. Chlorpromazine, they said, intensifies the potentially fatal side effects of STP. Not, chlorpromazine is less effective with STP. Not, the mechanism differs and you should use other approaches, intensifies the potentially fatal side effects. The language was strong, stronger, as it would turn out, than the evidence fully supported. But it was the language that went into the statement, and it was the language that the San Francisco Chronicle received and translated into a headline that ran the following morning. A warning on new drug. STP can be lethal. Headlines have a relationship to the truth that is, in the best of circumstances, approximate, and this was not the best of circumstances. The San Francisco Chronicle was a newspaper covering a neighbourhood that was generating more stories than it had staff to cover, about a drug it didn't understand, using a press conference statement from doctors who were working from a few weeks of clinical notes and a pharmacological analysis that was incomplete. The headline was not wrong in the sense of being fabricated. It was wrong in the sense of being more definitive than the underlying situation warranted. No one had died from STP. No one had died from STP. In the entirety of the 1967 distribution, 5,000 tablets at the solstice, Sand's subsequent production, the weeks of street availability that followed, there are no documented deaths attributable to the drug itself. The experiences were prolonged. They were frightening. They were, for the jailed patients especially, genuinely traumatic in ways that did not fully resolve for everyone who went through them. But DOM at 20 milligrams, distributed to thousands of people in a park in summer, did not kill anyone. The headline said it could. It was wrong about that specifically, and the wrongness mattered, not because the drug was safe, but because the gap between can cause severe and prolonged distress and can be lethal is the difference between a drug that requires careful handling and a drug that requires prohibition. The Chronicle's headline answered that question before it had been properly asked, in the most alarming terms available, and the alarm travelled faster than any nuance that followed. The chlorpromazine warning was precautionary. It was based on the observation that the drug did not respond to chlorpromazine in the expected way, combined with a pharmacological inference about what the interaction might be doing that later research would not fully support. Myers had concluded that STP's mechanism was different from LSD's. He was partially right about this, in the sense that DOM's pharmacokinetics and its stimulant component distinguished it meaningfully from LSD. He was not definitively right about the potentially fatal side effects of combining it with chlorpromazine. Subsequent research would suggest that the combination was not necessarily as dangerous as the press conference implied. But the warning landed. Doctors who encountered STP patients after the press conference read the warning and did not give chlorpromazine, which meant they used other approaches, which meant the talk-down model, the supportive care model, the patient in a calm room model became the default response, not because the chlorpromazine was definitively harmful, but because the warning had made giving it feel dangerous. An imprecise conclusion had produced a useful outcome through a chain of reasoning that was not entirely sound. This is a thing that happens in medicine more often than medical training tends to acknowledge. The Associated Press picked up the story. It ran nationally. Other papers ran versions of it, some more alarmist than the Chronicle, some slightly less. The wire copy that travelled from city to city carried the essential frame. New drug, worse than LSD, doctors don't know how to treat it, can be lethal. By July, STP had a national reputation as something that could kill you if the doctors gave you the wrong antidote, which was not quite true but was close enough to true that the direction of the effect was correct. People who would have taken it decided not to. People who were distributing it reconsidered. The underground press, which had been praising STP as the legal alternative to acid a few months earlier, went quiet on the subject. There is a version of the STP story, circulated in interviews Shulgin gave in later years, in which Nick Sand sold DOM by the kilogram to the Hells Angels, who then distributed it across the country, releasing tens of thousands of the 20-milligram tablets into the general population. If this is true, the crisis of the summer of '67 was not confined to Haight-Ashbury, but was playing out less visibly across a much larger geography. The claim appears in at least one published interview and has circulated in accounts of the episode ever since. The documentary evidence behind it is thin. What is certain is that Sand's production capacity, the 200-gallon soup kettle, the D&H custom research operation, was larger than the Solstice distribution alone could account for, and that DOM did appear on streets outside San Francisco in 1967, in amounts that suggest the supply chain extended beyond one park on one afternoon. What happened to all of it is not fully documented. The drug's disappearance from the record is partly a product of the press conference, and partly a product of its own reputation, and partly a product of the fact that nobody was looking very carefully at what happened to people who took a drug that had been effectively scared out of existence by a headline. The drug's cultural moment, which had lasted approximately 3 months from the first underground press coverage in April to the press conference in June, was over. The cultural moment of Haight-Ashbury was, by the late summer of 1967, also fraying in ways that had nothing specifically to do with STP. The 100,000 people who had arrived over the winter and spring had brought with them the full distribution of human needs and human problems that 100,000 people bring anywhere. Not everyone had come for consciousness expansion. Some had come because there was nowhere else to go. Some had come because the alternative, home, the suburb, the expectations, was worse than an uncertain summer in a neighbourhood that had made its reputation on abundance and welcome. The diggers' free kitchens were feeding more people than they had planned for. The clinic was treating more conditions than bad trips. Speed and heroin, which had been present at the edges of the scene since the beginning, had moved closer to the centre. The neighbourhood that had presented itself to the country as a working experiment in alternative living was discovering the limits of the experiment. George Harrison visited in August. The beetle who had been most publicly associated with the spiritual and psychedelic dimensions of the counterculture came to Haight-Ashbury to see what it actually looked like and left, by most accounts, disturbed by what he found. The squalor, the desperation underneath the stated idealism. The young people who were not exploring consciousness, but were simply lost and had been handed the language of exploration as a way of naming their lostness. He had been interested in LSD before the visit. He was not interested in it after. The mythology of the Summer of Love, which was already being assembled even as the summer happened because that is what mythologies do, selected out most of this. It selected in the music, the flowers, the idealism, the cultural creativity. It selected out the STP press conference, and the jailed patients and the heroin that was arriving in the neighbourhood, and the fact that the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was treating conditions that did not fit the story the era wanted to tell about itself. STP was part of what got selected out. It didn't fit either of the available narratives. It wasn't a triumph of psychedelic culture. because it had produced a crisis, and it wasn't a straightforward cautionary tale about drugs because the drug hadn't killed anyone, and the crisis had been managed, imperfectly but successfully, by a free clinic that the health department had declined to support. What STP was, in the historical record, was an inconvenience, something that complicated the story without resolving cleanly into any of the available morals. So most histories of the Summer of Love don't mention it. The ones that do give it a sentence or two and move on. On Christmas Eve 1967, law enforcement raided a tableting operation in Orinda, California, connected to Owsley Stanley. Owsley was arrested. The operation had been pressing LSD into tablets, Owsley's primary business, not STP, which he had effectively moved away from after the solstice crisis. But the arrest ended his ability to operate at any scale, and STP production under his network's umbrella stopped. Sand's operation continued for a time, but Sand himself was living under the cloud of the Colorado charges and the general legal pressure that was tightening around the underground chemistry world as the counterculture's moment passed. The DOM supply to Haight-Ashbury tapered off through the second half of 1967. By the end of the year, the drug was rarely seen. Its reputation had done what reputations do. It had spread further and faster than the facts behind it, and what had spread was the simplified version. STP was dangerous. STP could make the treatment kill you. STP lasted days, and there was nothing anyone could do. None of these things were precisely accurate. All of them were close enough to accurate that nobody who heard them wanted to verify the details by taking the drug. By November of 1967, the DEA's predecessor agency had published the first official mention of STP in its internal newsletter, Microgram, noting that it had acquired tablets of a new drug under that name in April of that year. Notably, the compound's identity, that STP was DOM, a specific chemical with a known structure, was still uncertain to the authorities at this point. The drug had been on the street for months, had produced a documented public health crisis, and had been the subject of a national press conference, and the government agency responsible for tracking controlled substances was still describing it in terms of its street name rather than its molecular identity. The question of what DOM was had not been a priority. The question of what to do about STP had been addressed by the press conference, which had addressed it more or less by making the drug so frightening that people stopped wanting to take it. The formal legal response was not fast. Fast in drug scheduling is a relative term. DOM was placed under federal control through the Drug Abuse Control Amendment in April of 1968, approximately 10 months after the solstice crisis. The basis for this was a limited number of studies, the press conference, the documented public health crisis, and the general momentum of the period toward treating new psychoactive compounds as presumptively dangerous until proven otherwise. The pharmacodynamics had not been established. The pharmacokinetics had not been established. The question of what DOM actually did, at various doses, in a controlled setting, to people who had consented to take it and been monitored while they did, that question had not been answered. The scheduling did not require an answer to that question. To understand what the scheduling meant in practice, it is useful to understand what the scheduling process did not require. It did not require evidence that the compound caused physical dependence. It did not require a documented body count. It did not require a demonstration that the drug's harms, at appropriate doses, outweighed its potential benefits. It required a determination that the compound had abuse potential, which DOM clearly had, given everything that had happened in Haight-Ashbury, and that it had no currently accepted medical use. The internal Dow disclosure from 1965, in which Shulgin had described DOM's potential psychiatric applications, was not a clinical trial. It was not peer-reviewed. It was not the kind of document that qualified as evidence of accepted medical use under the regulatory framework that was being applied. The therapeutic potential that Shulgin had documented was not, in the legal sense, accepted. So the determination was made: no accepted medical use, high abuse potential. Schedule 2 of the Drug Abuse Control Amendment, which was the framework available in 1968 until the Controlled Substances Act replaced it. 2 years later, in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act came into effect as the primary federal framework for drug regulation. DOM was moved from Drug Abuse Control Amendment scheduling into Schedule 1 of the CSA, the most restrictive category, the one reserved for substances with high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. The same category as heroin. the same category as LSD. Research on Schedule 1 substances required special licenses from the DEA, special institutional facilities, and layers of approval that most academic researchers could not navigate, and most pharmaceutical companies had no financial incentive to pursue. The compound had been classified before its basic pharmacology was understood, and the classification created the conditions under which the basic pharmacology could not easily be established afterward. This is the circularity that characterizes the history of most Schedule 1 substances. The classification that is supposed to reflect the absence of established medical use also creates the barriers that prevent medical use from being established. The compound goes in without an answer and comes out without one, and the years accumulate and the answer gets further away rather than closer. Shulgin's notes in the backyard laboratory in Lafayette said that at 3 to 5 milligrams DOM was his most promising compound. They said it had potential therapeutic value in a psychiatric context. They said he had stopped at 12 milligrams because 12 was too strong and had written that down carefully. None of this was part of the scheduling decision. None of it was required to be. The scheduling decision was about what had happened in 1967, not about what might have been studied in 1968 or 69 or 70 if anyone had looked carefully at the notes. The compound's career as a street drug had been approximately 6 months long. From April of 1967, when the Berkeley Barb ran its first piece and the drug began finding its way into the hands of people who had never heard of it, to the late autumn of the same year, when the reputation had hardened and the supply had dried up and the lawyers were accumulating. 6 months. A single summer. A single neighborhood. 5,000 free tablets at a summer solstice celebration, and everything that followed from them. It had been, in the language that public health uses for these things, an incident. Contained, localized, not the kind of crisis that generated sustained policy response or public memory. The kind that happened, generated a headline, generated a scheduling decision, and then became a footnote to the footnote that Haight-Ashbury had already become by the time anyone thought to write it down. The cultural machinery of the era was already selecting what to keep. The Summer of Love, as it would be remembered, as it has been remembered for 60 years in documentaries and retrospectives and the covers of anniversary magazine editions, is flowers and music, and the idea that a generation briefly believed in something. The STP press conference is not in the retrospectives. The jailed patients are not in the retrospectives. The 7 people who suffered significantly more than the people who received compassionate care are not in the retrospectives. They are in Smith's notes, which are in archives, which are in the places that things go when the cultural machinery has decided they don't fit the story. STP didn't fit either of the available stories. It wasn't a triumph of psychedelic culture, because it had produced a crisis. It wasn't a straightforward cautionary tale, because the drug hadn't killed anyone, and the crisis had been managed, however imperfectly, by a free clinic that the city government had declined to support. What STP was, in the historical record, was an inconvenience, something that complicated the narrative without resolving cleanly into any of the available conclusions. Most histories of the Summer of Love don't mention it. The ones that do give it a sentence or two. A few give it a paragraph. Most of the people who had taken it at the solstice went on with their lives. Some found it difficult for a time to sleep properly. Some had experiences they described years later as frightening in a way that had not fully faded. Most recovered. That is the honest summary of what happened to 5,000 people who took something they didn't fully understand on the longest day of a year that had promised more than it delivered. The 7 who went to jail recovered too, eventually. It took longer. In Lafayette, California, in a small laboratory behind his house, Alexander Shulgin kept working. The DOM crisis had not been the outcome he had intended. He had wanted the compound to find its way into medicine, into research, into the hands of therapists who could use it for the purpose he had believed it was suited for. What had found its way into medicine was a chlorpromazine warning and a Schedule 1 classification, and a reputation that made DOM the drug you mentioned when you wanted to illustrate what happened when psychedelics went wrong. He had other compounds, hundreds of them, eventually. The backyard laboratory produced new molecules with the consistent, systematic attention of someone who had decided that this was his life's work and intended to pursue it regardless of what the regulatory environment said about the category his work fell into. He held his DEA license. He remained, technically, within the law. He kept his notes. The notes on DOM were still there. 3 to 5 milligrams, his most promising compound, the one he had believed had value, the one that had gone into the world at 20 milligrams and come back as a cautionary tale. What the notes contained, and what the scheduling had made essentially inaccessible, was the question Shulgin had started with. What happened at the doses that were interesting rather than overwhelming? What happened if you took the time to find out slowly and carefully, with proper controls and consenting participants, and the full apparatus of scientific attention that the compound deserved? The compound was gone from the world. The question was still there, and Shulgin was still asking it. The laboratory behind Shulgin's house in Lafayette, California was a small building. Weatherboard construction, the kind of structure you'd mistake for a garden shed if the smell coming from it didn't suggest otherwise. The smell was of organic solvents and heat, and the particular chemistry of someone who had been running reactions for decades, and had accumulated in the process a set of working conditions that were entirely his own, and not easily described to anyone who hadn't experienced them. The neighbours, who had been his neighbours for a long time, had adjusted to the smell. The neighbours, who included a population of local law enforcement who were aware of what was happening in the shed, and had decided, for reasons that included the DEA licence on the wall, and the fact that Shulgin was a serious scientist with serious credentials, not to make a problem of it, had also adjusted. He worked in there the way he had always worked, systematically, carefully, with the notebooks open and the doses worked up from small, and the experiences documented in the rating scale he had developed years before. He was not working on DOM specifically. DOM was gone from his active program in the sense that it had gone as far as it could go under the current conditions, which were the conditions of Schedule 1, which were the conditions of impossibility. But DOM was still in the notebooks were still in the laboratory, and the laboratory was still producing. Between 1967 and 1991, when he would finally publish the record of what it had produced, Shulgin synthesized or characterized more than 200 psychoactive compounds. Not 200 variations on a theme, 200 distinct molecular structures, each with its own pharmacological profile, each documented through the same patient methodology: synthesize, characterize chemically, determine starting dose, test, record results in full, continue or stop. The work had the quality of a systematic survey of a territory that nobody else was mapping, because nobody else had the combination of legal standing, chemical competence, and personal willingness to do what the survey required. He was not doing this entirely alone. His wife, Anne, whom he had married in 1979, was present for many of the experiments. Anne Shulgin was not a chemist. She was a lay therapist with a background in psychology, and her contribution to the work was not synthetic but experiential and conceptual. She took the compounds with him. She documented her own responses. She brought a perspective on the human dimensions of the experiences that Shulgin's chemical training did not provide on its own. The partnership was, in retrospect, the arrangement that the work required: a chemist who could make the molecules, and a psychologist who could describe what they did to a person from the inside. The compounds they were testing included DOM's molecular cousins, the DOX family, the class of compounds built on the same substituted phenethylamine backbone as DOM, but with different halogens at the 4 position of the phenyl ring, was expanding in the backyard laboratory throughout the 1970s and 80s. Where DOM had a methyl group at the 4 position, DOB had a bromine atom, DOI had an iodine atom, DOC had a chlorine atom. Each substitution produced a compound with a distinct pharmacological profile, different potency, different duration, different character, while retaining the family resemblance that came from the shared backbone and the shared mechanism of serotonin 2A receptor agonism. These were not, in the immediate aftermath of the DOM crisis, the kinds of compounds that the regulatory environment welcomed. DOB was placed into Schedule 1 in 1973, 2 years after DOM. The others followed as they were identified. The DEA's approach to the DOX family was shaped by what had happened with DOM in 1967. A psychedelic amphetamine had caused a public health crisis and had been classified before its pharmacology was understood, and the lesson the regulatory apparatus appeared to have drawn from this was that the appropriate response to related compounds was to classify them before their pharmacology was understood, to avoid the risk of a repeat. The compounds continued to exist in Shulgin's notebooks regardless of their regulatory status. The notebooks were Shulgin's record, and the record was comprehensive, and the record survived the scheduling. What the scheduling could not do to the DOX family any more than it had done to DOM, was answer the scientific questions that the compounds raised. The question of what DOM did at therapeutic doses, the question of how the DOX family's variations in potency and duration mapped onto variations in the underlying pharmacology, the question of what the serotonin 2A receptor was actually doing in human beings when something bound to it with the specificity that the DOX compounds demonstrated. These questions were still there. The scheduling had not answered them. It had only made them harder to ask in a laboratory setting. Shulgin had a DEA Schedule I research license. This is one of the more remarkable institutional facts about his career, given that the license authorized him to work with the same class of substances that the same institution had placed into the most restrictive possible category. The license existed because Shulgin had credentials, genuine academic and professional credentials, peer-reviewed publications, a track record that institutions recognized, and because the DEA had, in the early years of the Controlled Substances Act, maintained a practice of licensing serious researchers to work with Schedule I substances for legitimate scientific purposes. The license was specific. It covered specific compounds for specific purposes in specific facilities. What Shulgin was doing in the backyard laboratory in Lafayette, synthesizing novel compounds, testing them on himself and Anne, documenting the results in his notebooks, occupied a legal space that was ambiguous in ways that all parties to the arrangement had tacitly agreed not to examine too closely. He was a licensed researcher. The compounds he was making were not always covered by the license. The license covered what it covered, and the rest was in a grey area that the DEA had decided for the time being to treat as grey rather than black. This arrangement held for decades. It held through the 1970s and 80s, while Shulgin accumulated his notebooks and his wife accumulated her own records, and the backyard laboratory continued producing at a pace that, by any reasonable measure, was extraordinary for a single researcher working without institutional support. In 1976, Shulgin introduced MDMA to a therapist named Leo Zepp. MDMA, methylenedioxymethamphetamine, later better known as ecstasy, was not a compound Shulgin had originally synthesized. It had been made by a Merck chemist in 1912 and then forgotten. Shulgin resynthesized it, tested it on himself, and recognized in its properties something that he thought might be genuinely useful in a therapeutic context. It produced empathy and emotional openness without the full hallucinatory intensity of classical psychedelics, and it appeared to be relatively safe at appropriate doses. He introduced it to Zeph, who introduced it to a network of therapists who used it in therapy sessions for years before MDMA became widely known, became popular at clubs and parties, attracted regulatory attention, and was placed into Schedule I in 1985. The pattern was repeating. A compound Shulgin believed had therapeutic value, a route into the world that bypassed the institutional development process. Public exposure at doses and in contexts that were not therapeutic. A crisis of public perception. A scheduling decision made before the therapeutic questions were answered. Shulgin watched it happen to MDMA. He had watched it happen to DOM. He kept working. In 1984, the DEA raided his laboratory. Not, as it turned out, because of anything he had specifically done. The raid was part of a broader crackdown on underground drug chemistry networks, and Shulgin's laboratory was included in the sweep by virtue of its association with the world of psychedelic chemistry. The agents went through the laboratory, they went through the notebooks, they went through the compound library, the collection of synthesized materials that Shulgin had accumulated over decades, and they did not, ultimately, arrest him or revoke his license. What they did was make clear that the tacit arrangement of the previous 2 decades was being reconsidered, and that the grey area in which he had been operating was subject to renegotiation at the DEA's discretion. Shulgin responded in the way that a person responds when they understand that the grey area is narrowing. He decided to make the record public before the opportunity closed. The result was PIHKAL, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, was published in 1991. Shulgin was 66 years old. He had been synthesizing and testing compounds for 3 decades, and had accumulated in the notebooks a record that had no equivalent in the scientific literature on psychedelic pharmacology. PIHKAL was his attempt to put that record somewhere. It could not be raided, could not be classified, could not be placed into a regulatory category that would make it inaccessible. A published book is constitutionally protected speech. The synthesis procedures it contained were not covered by the Controlled Substances Act. Anyone who wanted them could read them. The book had two halves. The first was a memoir, a novelist account of Shulgin's life and his relationship with Anne, the story of how two people had spent their lives doing something unusual and had found, in the doing of it, a partnership that was genuinely extraordinary. The second half was the chemical record. 237 compounds, each with its synthesis procedure, its chemical characterization, its dosage information, and the personal notes from Shulgin's self-experiments and from Anne's parallel documentation. Every compound he had made and tested, every dose, every effect, every note. DOM was in there. In the section Shulgin called his magical half-dozen, the 6 phenethylamine compounds he considered his most significant, DOM was listed. Not as a cautionary tale, not as the drug that caused the summer solstice crisis. As a compound with genuine scientific and potential therapeutic interest, tested carefully at doses between 1 and 12 milligrams, documented in the kind of detail that a careful scientist documents things he believes matter. The published record said what the unpublished record had always said. At 3 to 5 milligrams, DOM was his most promising compound. At 12 milligrams, it was too strong. At 20 milligrams, the dose that Owsley had pressed into 5,000 tablets and distributed in a park, it was something entirely different from what Shulgin had made and studied. PIHKAL was, among other things, an act of rescue. Shulgin knew that the regulatory conditions were unlikely to improve, that the compounds he had documented were going to remain inaccessible to formal research for the foreseeable future, and that if the record disappeared with him, the questions it contained would disappear too. Publication was the only mechanism available to him for ensuring that the record survived. The book sold steadily. It found readers in pharmacology, in chemistry, in medicine, in the counterculture, in law enforcement, where it generated enough concern that the DEA eventually used the published synthesis procedures as the basis for an analogue drug case, in what was either an irony or a straightforward demonstration of the regulatory system's priorities, depending on how you chose to look at it. 3 years after PIHK, he published TIHKAL, Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, covering the other major family of psychedelic compounds he'd worked with. The project of the backyard laboratory, the decades of notebooks, was now in print. It was not going anywhere. Shulgin died on June 2nd, 2014. He was 88 years old. He had spent the last years of his life with Anne at their farmhouse property in Lafayette. The same house, the same laboratory behind it, the same compound library, diminished but still present, declining in health but not in engagement. People visited, people who had been students, researchers, curious lay people, the occasional journalist. He held an annual party at the farm. The laboratory was, by the end, more historical artifact than active workspace. The notebooks remained. The obituaries described him as the godfather of psychedelics, which is not entirely wrong and is not entirely right, in the way that epithets for complex people are usually both. He was a chemist who happened to be working at the intersection of pharmacology and phenomenology, in conditions that no institutional framework could have produced, and that no institutional framework, once the regulatory environment hardened, would have permitted. He had operated in the grey area for as long as the grey area existed. When it closed, he had published what he had found so that the grey area's closure could not close the record. The record included DOM. The record included the magical half-dozen. The record included the question that Shulgin had been asking since 1963 or 64, when he first synthesized the compound in a corporate laboratory in Michigan, and tested it on himself at doses that stopped, deliberately at 12 milligrams. What happens if you study this carefully, at the doses that are interesting rather than overwhelming, with the full apparatus of rigorous attention that the compound deserves? That question had not been answered in 1967. It had not been answered in 1970, when the scheduling made it harder to ask. It had not been answered in 1991, when PIHKAL put it back into the public record. It had not been answered when Shulgin died, and it had not been answered in the years that followed, but it had not disappeared either. The DOX compounds, DOM's molecular cousins, had, in the years since Shulgin's systematic exploration, found a use that was not recreational and not therapeutic, but scientific in the most basic sense. They had become tools. DOI in particular, the iodinated variant, the one with an iodine atom at the 4 position where DOM has a methyl group, had become what researchers described as a pivotal compound in the study of serotonin receptor pharmacology. The specificity with which DOI bound to the serotonin 2A receptor, the predictability of its action, the fact that it could be radio-labeled with a radioactive iodine isotope and thereby tracked through the brain with imaging technology. These properties made DOI a research instrument of genuine utility, the kind of tool that allows questions about receptor function to be asked that cannot be asked with less specific compounds. Researchers had used DOI to study the serotonin 2A receptor's role in anxiety, in depression, in chronic pain, in the way the brain processes threat signals, in the mechanisms underlying obsessive-compulsive disorder. The compound that the 1967 press conference had described as potentially lethal had become, in the hands of molecular neuroscientists who were not distributing it at music festivals, a standard laboratory instrument for understanding how the brain worked at the receptor level. DOC, the chlorinated variant, had found similar utility. So had DOB, which had been Schedule 1 since 1973, and which researchers had continued to use for receptor mapping despite the scheduling, because the research licenses that the DEA issued to qualified scientists allowed work with Schedule 1 substances in controlled settings for legitimate scientific purposes. The DOX family, in other words, had done what Shulgin had always hoped DOM itself would do. It had contributed to scientific understanding of the serotonin 2A receptor in ways that had implications for the treatment of the conditions that receptor was involved in. Not through the therapeutic route Shulgin had envisioned, not through a clinical program that started with his 3 to 5 milligram notes and ended with a treatment, but through the molecular neuroscience route, through the receptor mapping and the imaging studies and the accumulation of basic knowledge that is, in theory, the foundation on which therapeutic applications eventually stand. The question Shulgin had been asking had been partially answered by people working with his compound's cousins, in laboratories that had the institutional support and regulatory clearance that his backyard laboratory had never had. The answer was, yes, the serotonin 2A receptor is important in ways we didn't fully understand in 1967. Yes, these compounds are useful for studying it. Yes, the pharmacological territory that DOM sat at the edge of has turned out to be relevant to conditions that matter to medicine. The compound itself remained unexamined. The question about what DOM did at 3 milligrams, in controlled conditions, with consenting participants and monitoring and the full apparatus that serious research required, that question was still unanswered. But its cousins had been useful. The family had contributed. The work had not been entirely lost. In 2023, the DEA proposed placing DOI and DOC into Schedule 1. The research community responded with alarm. Scientists who had been using DOI as a laboratory tool for decades, who depended on it for receptor mapping studies, for anxiety research, for the kind of basic molecular neuroscience that did not make headlines, but provided the foundational understanding on which clinical applications were eventually built, submitted comments to the DEA arguing that scheduling DOI and DOC would not prevent abuse, it would prevent research. The people who used DOI were not distributing it at music festivals. They were using it to study how brains processed fear and how those mechanisms might be implicated in conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, and what the receptor-level pharmacology of the next generation of psychiatric treatments might look like. Drug policy advocacy organizations, the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, among others, also objected. The argument they made was structural, that Schedule 1, as a category, was designed for substances with no accepted medical use, and that DOI had an accepted research use, which was not the same thing as a medical use but was not nothing, and that eliminating that use by scheduling would produce a clear harm, the loss of ongoing research, without producing a corresponding benefit in the form of reduced abuse, because the people using DOI for research were not the people who would be deterred by scheduling, and the people who might use it recreationally were not, apparently, doing so in any quantity that had generated a public health concern. The argument was, in structure and in content, the same argument that should have been made about DOM in 1968. It had not been made about DOM in 1968, because in 1968 there was no established research use to point to. DOM had been on the street for 6 months and in a crisis for 3 of them, and in the notes of a corporate chemist for the 4 years before that. The questions about its potential had not been asked in any institutional setting. There was no community of researchers whose work depended on continued access to it. There was only Shulgin's notebooks and the press conference and the Chronicle headline and the momentum of a regulatory system that was moving in one direction. The DOI situation was different in the most important respect. There was a community of researchers, and there was ongoing work, and there was a record of what the compound had contributed to the understanding of the serotonin 2A receptor over the previous several decades. The argument could be made with evidence. Whether the argument would be heard was, at the time of the proposal and for some time after it, uncertain. The story of DOM was repeating itself at one remove in the regulatory process that was being applied to its descendants. It didn't end when it was supposed to. It had simply moved. LSD taught America what a bad trip looked like. The lesson was 8 to 12 hours, intense and frightening, ends when it's supposed to end. The protocol was established. The clinic was built for it. The doctors knew what to reach for. STP taught doctors that they had no idea what a bad trip could become. The lesson was 16 to 24 hours, slow to start, hard to treat, responding to environment in ways that medicine had not built a protocol for. The protocol failed. The clinic had to improvise. The Swami sat in a circle. The notebooks accumulated. The lesson that the lesson produced, that a drug could require time and calm rather than pharmacological intervention, that the environment of care was itself a form of treatment, that the hostile institutional response to drug crises could make those crises worse, was a genuine advance in the understanding of what psychedelic medicine needed to be. David Smith's clinic was a model. The talk-down approach it pioneered became the standard. The notes Smith kept became evidence. The contrast between his patients and the 7 in the jail cells became an argument that took decades to fully win, but that the evidence behind it did not stop supporting. The drug that produced all of this disappeared. 6 months on the street, and then a press conference, and then a headline, and then a scheduling decision, and then the notebooks in a backyard laboratory, and then, eventually, a chapter in a book that a 66-year-old chemist wrote, because he wanted to make sure the record survived him. The record survived him. He died in 2014. The record is still there. What Shulgin had feared, pharmacological oblivion, did happen to DOM. Not because no one looked, because the looking happened in the wrong order, at the wrong dose, in the wrong context, and the result was a crisis that produced a reputation, that produced a classification, that produced conditions in which the questions the compound raised could not be systematically answered. The oblivion was not negligence. It was the outcome of a sequence of decisions, each of which made sense in its own context, that together produced a result that nobody had intended, and that served nobody's interest particularly well. Shulgin had tried to prevent it. He had passed the synthesis to Owsley to prevent it. Owsley had distributed the tablets to introduce the compound to the world and prevent it. The introduction had been catastrophic in the specific way that an introduction at 20 milligrams to 5,000 people in a park on the longest day of the year could be expected to be catastrophic in retrospect, if not in prospect. The crisis had produced the classification. The classification had produced the oblivion. The oblivion was, in the end, exactly what Shulgin had been trying to avoid. He caused the thing he was trying to prevent. This is not a moral judgment. It is what happened. The intention was to rescue a compound from institutional indifference, and the rescue attempt produced the conditions for the compound's institutional burial. The gap between the intention and the outcome is one of the more illuminating gaps in this story, because it's not a gap that was produced by malice or negligence on anyone's part. It was produced by the collision between a drug that had been carefully studied at low doses and distributed carelessly at high ones, a medical system that reached for the tool it had and found it didn't fit, a regulatory system that moved when the public health evidence required it to move, and a cultural moment that was already ending by the time any of this was fully understood. The question remains, at 3 to 5 milligrams, the doses Shulgin tested, the doses he documented, the doses at which he called DOM his most promising compound, something happened that he believed was worth understanding. He documented it carefully. The documentation is in PIHKAL, in the section on the magical half dozen. in the notes that describe what the experience felt like at doses that were interesting rather than overwhelming. The experience at those doses is not something that medicine has examined in a clinical setting. The compound remains Schedule 1. The research barriers remain in place. The question Shulgin was asking in 1963 when he first synthesized the molecule and began working up the dose is the same question that the compound is not permitted to answer under current conditions. In Golden Gate Park on June 21st of 1967, 5,000 people swallowed 20 milligrams of something they didn't fully understand, in a context that was not designed to help them understand it, at a dose that nobody had tested during a summer that was already running on borrowed momentum. Most of them were fine. Some of them were not fine for a long time. 7 of them, who ended up in a jail cell instead of a clinic, were not fine for longer than anyone should have been not fine for. And somewhere in the park, before any of this happened, the drug was doing what Shulgin had always believed it could do, at the right dose, in the right conditions, with the right attention. Something that didn't last 16 to 24 hours. Something that ended when it was supposed to end. Something that the person taking it could integrate and understand and carry forward. Nobody documented that version. The notebooks that survived are the corporate notebooks in Michigan, which noted a patent disclosure and nothing further, and the personal notebooks in Lafayette, which noted careful self-experiments at doses that stopped at 12 milligrams. The version that got 5,000 people into a park in the summer of '67 was not the version in the notebooks. It was the version that escaped from the notebooks. And what escaped, what went into those tablets, what was handed to strangers for free on the longest day of the year, was not what Shulgin made. It was what happened to what Shulgin made when what he made stopped being his. The compound is still Schedule 1. The questions are still there. The notebooks are still in print. And somewhere in the gap between what the notes describe at 3 milligrams and what the regulation permits at any milligrams, the story is still running. It didn't end when it was supposed to. It hasn't ended yet.